Hi and welcome to the fourth session with a Meet-O-Meter app. So I've got a couple of requests that people want to see me implement backend, and I got half an hour, 40 minutes or so to kill. I've been super busy, so that's why it's taken me so long to do the fourth session. But hopefully, after this session, we'll have a fully working RESTful backend service using WebAPI 2.1 and Entity Framework 6 code first for SQL storage. And I'm thinking, since I don't have that much time, I'm going to leave the multi-tenant support and third-party authentication providers for authentication for the next session. So we're going to have one account and sync that with a database. So let's not waste any more time and jump right into it. So we got this app that measures meeting cost. They can start and stop. We have 10 people in a meeting with an average salary of 30,000, and we can measure the cost for the meeting, and we can store it. So right now this is stored in the local storage, into local storage for the browser. So if we would access the same site from a different device, we would get an empty list. Right. So let's add support for WebAPI2. Let's also add support for Entity Framework 6. And I already know now that I'm going to want to unit test my controllers, and I'm going to want to use some sort of IOC container. And my favorite container is Unity, so I'm going to add the Unity NuGet package immediately. So we have a Unity Bootstrapper for ASP.NET Web API provided by Microsoft. So we installed that as well. And I don't think I have time to actually unit test the controllers now, but I'm going to design for it, and hopefully we'll address it in a different screen cast. So we have all our references in place. So you have a Unity config and a Unity Web API activator. If you haven't used Unity before, or if you're an Inject fan, you can read about it for yourself. Just Google it. But basically, what you do is you register your interfaces to which concrete classes they should resolve to. We'll register this in a while. So let's get an API up and running. First of all, we're going to need to configure the API. So let's add a global ASIX file and just add some default routes. And what I usually do is I'll just copy the default settings from a new project. So file, oops, new project, create a Web API project. Right, so now it's created. We can take a look into the global ASICs. We have some configuration here. So I'm interested in configuring the web API. Let's copy this in. Let's create a web API config under app start. Get rid of the namespace. And all this does is actually configure the web API routes and add a default route. So I'm not going to do anything fancy with the routes. We're just going to use the default configuration. Right. So I think that's what we need from the new project. We can go ahead and close it. Let's add a controllers folder. Add a new controller. Let's add an empty controller. Call it meetings controller. So let's see if we can hit this from the browser. Let's just do a public enumerable string. The default gef method. Let's return hello world as a string array. Right, so now I should be able to hit API/meetings. Oh, autocomplete. API/meetings. It should return this list. Right, so let's compile this. And this is the address for my on my IS. And let's see here. Let's do a get API meetings. We can see here that it works. So that's good. We got an API up and running. Now we don't actually want to return these strings here, so we're gonna want to return our own meeting model. And we already know what the meeting model looks like since we already done this in the client. So we have a meeting model at the client. I think we're gonna have a table in the database that looks exactly like this. So let's create our database model. I usually implement a simple repository pattern. It might or might not be overkill for this, but I'm gonna do it anyhow. So appdb context. Let's create the database. DB context. And yeah, we probably want to have a DB set of meetings here. So we want a meeting class. So I'm gonna add a new folder called entities. It's gonna hold our POCOs. Right, so we have a meeting. Let's copy paste this in from the JavaScript code and create it. So by having a property called ID, Entity Framework will figure out that it's probably an identity column and it's going to be the key. So let's add date. People property and average salary. duration seconds. Alright, so this is our model. It looks exactly like the one on the client side, except that we don't usually use camel casing on the server side. So I'm actually going to address this by configuring WebAPI to return our models with camel casing, even though they are stored and are reflected by a class that doesn't use camel casing. So before jumping ahead to that, let me illustrate the problem. So we have a meeting collection, meetings, and if you don't override have a constructor, Entity Framework will give our database name. I think will be the namespace dot appdb context dot something. So I want to be able to name my database to whatever I want. And the way I usually do this is by having a app setting. Let's call it database name. Excuse me. Database name. Not there. Let's call the database meeting. Yeah, that's okay. So I do this because sometimes you can't control what the database name fully. So on my local SQL server, I can call it whatever I want. But if I would like to use Surfdown as a hosting provider, they always prefix the database name with my user account name because they live in a shared environment. So for web config, I'm gonna name it to whatever I want because it's my local SQL server, the default setting. But in the release config, I can actually transform this value to whatever suits my hosting. So we're gonna get a database with a name meeting, and actually reminds me that we need to change the default connection factory that Entity Framework uses to be able to point out where to create the database. So if we look at the documentation here at MSDN, we have a couple of sample configurations, and the one I'm looking for is right here. Okay, so we're going to be able to specify the data source as our local host and the database name and so forth. So I'm going to create it locally here. And here we could go ahead and specify the database name, but since we're going to use the app setting, that would be redundant. So before creating this, I'm going to enable migrations. Now we have a migrations folder with a configuration. So we can set automatic migrations enabled true. And here's a seed method that will be run after migrating to the latest version. So we can put in some test data here. What migrations usually do, it should add an initial create. I don't know why it hasn't added it. So I'm going to add an initial migration called initial create that represents the initial schema. So now it checks if the database exists, which it doesn't, and it creates a migration schema. So we have one simple table, and we'll create it. And if we would to migrate down, we'll just drop the table. So now let's create a database. We could go ahead and set the DB initializer from global ASAX, but I'm just going to do everything from the package manager console, just for simplicity. Alright, so let's see if we have a database. So here's Management Studio, and yeah, we have a meeting database, which shouldn't have any data yet. No. Alright, so let's add some test data here. We can check if we don't have any meetings. Let's add some test data. Minutes, 10 people. Let's add a couple of records. 5 and 8. Management having 15 minutes of meeting. All right. Good. I don't know if this would run the seed method. Yeah, it did. So now we should have some data. Excellent. So now we have some data in our database. Let's get this from our controller. So in our controller here, in the spirit of testable code, let's return HTTP action results, and let's just new up a new context and return it. DB new app DB context, and return the meetings. So we're gonna refactor this in a minute. Alright, so in our browser here, we can try to get the meetings now. And we actually successfully fetched the records from the database. And we can see a problem here. Our model on the client side in the browser uses camel casing, and the model on the server side doesn't use camel casing. So there's a way to configure WebAPI to use camel casing. This guy Scott Allen has blogged about it, and it's just a matter of configuration. So let's configure WebAPI to do this for us. Right, so now we should get the camel casing. Excellent. So I'm not that satisfied with how the controller looks right now. I don't like newing up the DB context like this because it makes the code less testable. It actually makes it not testable. So I'm going to implement a simple repository pattern here so I can mock the DB context. Let's add a new class, a meeting repository. Let's define interface in the same file. Oops. And have a method return meetings get all. We probably want to have a post, or I mean a save or update, which returns a meeting. Save or update, save or we also want to delete a meeting. Pass in an ID. And in here we can go ahead and new up a DB context. Return DB meetings. Server update. We should probably try to find the meeting. So a real simple repository here. And if entity is null, let's new it up and add it to our database. We could use attach here as well, but I like to add it. And then just do a save changes, return the saved entity. Of course, we also want to actually update the properties. So people just bear with me now as I do this. I have trouble typing entity. I seem to type ente for some reason. Did I forget something? I don't think so, right? Okay, so we have all the values there. And our delete method. Should try to find a record, and if we did find something, let's delete it. Let's create a flag, did delete, return that. I'm thinking that we probably want to return not found if you try to delete a meeting that doesn't exist on the server side. So that's why I return a bool if we actually did delete it from the database. Alright, so we have a simple repository class here that should do the job just fine. And now we want to resolve the repository. instead of newing it up. Right, so we want to do something like this to a constructor, so we can easily mock the repository when we use this in our unit tests. Oops, I'm a bit stressed out because my daughter's gonna be home in a second, and I want to get this screencast out there. So we have a repository, and let's just call get all. And as I said before, we probably want to be able to create and delete records as well. So create, we'll do it with a post, and we'll get the data from the body meeting. Forgot the type. And yeah, let's just be really optimistic here. We just assume that everything will be peachy. So we'll just save or update the meeting. So when you pass in a meeting, the ID will be 0, and once we store it to the database, we'll actually have an ID which we'll be able to return in our REST API. And let's create the delete method, which actually should return something other than OK if it goes wrong. Sorry. Whoops. So if we managed to delete the ID, it should return OK. Otherwise, return not found. Right. So this should give us an error right now because we haven't configured Unity to resolve the repository class. So we should see this error in the Postman client. Yeah, make sure that the controller has a parameterless constructor. So what happened was that WebAPI came and looked for a parameterless constructor because it didn't know how to resolve this parameter here. And it didn't found one, so it threw it. So we got an error. I've already added Unity, and we got an activator for that, which actually sets the dependency resolver to the Unity dependency resolver. So all we need to do is register our type here. Meeting repository should resolve a meeting repository. Alright, so that should be it. Let's close some tabs here. Alright, so if you get the meetings now, we should actually hit the controller and get it from the database. Sweet. Let's try the post. Let's do a post. Oh yeah, right. So we're gonna need to add a header and say that the content type is application JSON. Let's create it now. Right. So we have for an entity with ID 4 here. So if we get all the results now, we have 4 posts. Right, and we should be able to update something as well, although we can't update from the app right now. So let's update the one with ID 1. Say there were actually 15 people in the meeting. And it seems like it worked. So there were 15 people there now. Let's try to delete the post with ID 2. ID 2. Let's do a delete. Okay, it got deleted. Make sure it's deleted. Excellent. Let's do delete for an ID that doesn't exist. And we got a not found. So our API seems to work exactly as we want it to work. We got a nice and testable meetings controller. We're not going to write any unit tests now. It's pretty straightforward, but I think we're going to address that in a different screencast. Now we just want to use this from our HTTP client. And that shouldn't be any problem. So right now this goes against local storage. Let's open up our meetings controller and resolve HTTP service. And now we get the meetings from the storage service, which goes against the local storage. So let's enqueue get. Let's see what this returns. I think it returns a promise. Yeah, it returns a promise. We're going to be real optimistic here. I don't have the time to write any error handling here. We can address that in the same screencast as writing unit tests for the server side. So on success, just interested in the data, you actually get status codes back as well, among other things. Let's type data. And as we could see from the Postman client, we get a list with sessions, and that's exactly what we want. So let's just store it into meetings. Let's do this after we've added a watch, so we'll persist the result from the server. Don't know why the indent doesn't work here for me. Wants to tab it in. All right. So let's see if this fetches the data for us from the server. And it does. So now we have 3 records here. A moment ago we had 1. Let's confirm that this looks like the posts in our database. Yeah, looks pretty accurate. All right, so now we can actually get the meetings from the server side. We also want to store them and delete them. So let's do the post first. So, I already written a comment here. So this is the meeting model that we want to store. Meeting store. So let's once again just assume that everything goes perfect. We post our meeting to store. Which will return our promise. We get our data back here. And this is actually the entity that we want to store. Because it will contain our our new ID from the database. We created it with 0, and we'll hopefully get a post which will set the ID for us. And let's do the delete also. Right, so before we splice it from our meetings collection, let's actually do a delete to the server as well. API meetings. Right, and we want to pass an ID here. We'll get it from the meeting to delete. Once again, assume everything went fine. And when we actually delete it on the server side, it's removed from the client as well. So we have no error handling here, but that's okay for now. So we should be able to, let's actually attach the debugger. To get, post, and delete. So when we load the page, we can see that the debugger hit a breakpoint here. And we get all the meetings. And we want to be able to delete a meeting. We want to delete the record with ID 1. So we'll go in here. We found an entity. Excellent. We removed it and save the change. Return OK to the client. And it's deleted. If we start a new meeting, we can stop it, we can store it, and we post it from the client. It gets persisted. So we've successfully implemented a backend in 40 minutes. We have a RESTful API and a SQL database backing this app right now. But it's only a single account. So in the next session, I'm going to try to address making this Meter app a multi-tenant site by adding support for third-party authenticators like Facebook and Google or Twitter. I don't know. We'll just do the one that's the simplest. Right, so I think my daughter's gonna be home in any minute now. That's everything for this session. I hope you've learned something, and have a nice day until next time. Bye.